This is the biggest one, the picture here, 30,000 people marching. And the date was August 31, 2002. And they're marching, as you see on the right, against a well-defended fortress, which is called Santon. It's the bourgeois zone of Africa now, really. It's where the elites across the continent park their money, a financial center that used to be in central Johannesburg. It's now out in Santon, in Edge City. And that was also hosting in August 31, 2002, the World Summit on Sustainable Development. So you'll see in a moment why we can bring together these ideas of popular resistance and social protest, and I think proto-socialist concepts of where we need to go with our politics. And this book, actually, because co-editor, can you stand up? Graham Arian, who's a Toronto environmental lawyer and has a fabulous chapter. Part of the real guts of the book is the master's thesis that Graham did when he was based at our center on the fine details, the specifics of the carbon trade. So it is commodified, but I can also send you a copy on a PDF if you email me for free, so we can start the spirit of decommodification. Let's just quickly run through a couple of the Al Gore kind of critiques that we can, I think, all agree with. The concern here.
We've got an issue on you.
Okay, are we? Am I blocking out? Oh, that's all right then. Now the ice cap melting in the Arctic, the ice-free summer predicted by 2050, the Greenland shrinkage of the ice and the disappearance of, or the loss of polar bears that have been observed. Africa, of course, being profoundly affected, as Ian's already said. Lake Chad drying up, Mount Kilimanjaro's glaciers melting. And then this statistic from Pachari, the chair of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last August, 50% reduction in yields of agriculture by 2020 in some African countries, and in Africa, crop net revenues fall by as much as 90% by 2100. Small-scale farmers being the most affected, not having access to irrigation. So, of course, it's going to be variable and more floods. Mozambique underwater recently, more droughts in areas, much more severe storms. So, the African continent getting hit extremely hard. Southern Africa already experiencing this quite inexorable rise in temperature, which is why the World Summit on Sustainable Development was a shocking disappointment in 2002. We have a great cartoonist, by the way, Zafiro. We'll see one or two of his cartoons. And this incredible sort of blind spot during the World Summit, this was the 10 years after the Rio Earth Summit, reflected in protesters raising these issues, raising the problem of water privatization. We had Mont Barlow with the Blue Planet Project, the whole struggle against what they euphemistically call public-private partnerships, but basically the commodification of everything in nature that was underway with the World Summit and hosted by South Africa, where, as I'm going to show, there's an extraordinary responsibility to do something about climate change given South Africa's contribution. So nothing to be gained from these elite processes we learned, like the year before at the World Conference Against Racism, and like pretty much all of the other big global governance gimmicks that we've seen since as well. Instead, we just got the kind of corporate rhetoric of sustainable development, which disguises all the commodification processes and profit and all the rest that you have become familiar with. Thabo Mbeki there welcoming in big capital and welcoming in the United Nations and coming up with documents and work that we've all been struggling against subsequently. And it's in that sense we can look at Canada and South Africa, the US, down there, China, as countries with very, very low levels of awareness because these ruling elites have just not really allowed this issue to get out into public discourse as acceptable concerns. So for Canada, just 57%, I think, is the percentage that are aware this is a serious problem, according to a 2006 Global Scan report. South Africa at just 45%, and the U.S. sort of in between. So it's sort of elite pressures to either deny or just keep discussion down. We just simply haven't had enough discussion in South Africa and in many African countries, whereas in Latin America, Nicaragua, Chile, Costa Rica, Guatemala, El Salvador, Argentina, Brazil, it's in the sort of 70s to 90% range, and Europe in the next range of 60 to 75% awareness. So it gives you a sense of differences and why our countries, South Africa, Canada, are terribly important to raise the public consciousness. But there's material interests that explain that, and those would really have a lot to do with the incredibly cheap electricity that's on supply for big capital, not for ordinary people, of course, but for the biggest smelters and mining houses in the world. Very, very cheap electricity in South Africa, half as cheap as Chile, Poland, then US and Canada come after that. And that just reflects the old apartheid structural economic relationship between the big mining houses, first finding diamonds and gold, and then their development of a big electricity industry, a state industry, because they didn't have enough small private sector suppliers that could go deep, 2 miles deep into the ground to get the gold. Well, that has left South Africa with the worst carbon footprint in Africa. Certainly 42% of the CO2 emissions from Africa are from South Africa. But if we take it as a percentage of economic activity per person, the CO2 emissions are 20 times worse than even the United States. So we have a kind of a major struggle to just say, well, South Africa is part of the global north in this too. And this is some of the context that means we've been able to find, in spite of lack of big media coverage and general awareness, some really interesting areas of social struggle. I'll introduce you to one in my home city of Durban. Well, before we do that, just to quickly look at how you can cut your CO2 emissions. You can have capitalism imposed on you and crash your economy by half, and your industrial economy is basically shrinking so much that in the former Soviet Union, say Ukraine, the CO2 reductions were 50% over 1990 to 2003, and Russia by 25%. So unplanned and obviously huge social costs, and the destruction, the creative destruction that capitalism goes through periodically. A second creative way to solve this problem is to have a technical fix, right? That's what we've been told from time to time. Sequestration can sequester the carbon and find creative ways to store the carbon. Here's one a couple weeks ago that was exposed in the New York Times. Planktos, a California company, is trying to turn a profit by fertilizing the ocean with iron dust. But it canceled planned field tests, citing a lack of funds. The company's website, a note explained a highly effective disinformation campaign for the cancellation, i.e. scientists who say this is just ridiculous, this is crazy. The business plan had been to sell carbon offset credits earned by creating blooms of phytoplankton that in theory would absorb a certain amount of the climate warming gas, carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, and then sink to the seabed. Oh, how safe. The credits would be sold in the growing market for such offsets to compensate for unavoidable emissions of carbon dioxide. Lovely kind of phrases here. Too bad it didn't work. Anyway, there'll be plenty more gimmicks and crazy ideas like this. But this is a dangerous one at the core of Kyoto. We call it the privatization of the air, the carving up of the commons to the sort of final frontier. They call it carbon trading. And Al Gore supports it entirely. I mean, he's got a good handle on what the problem is and the dangers and the risks. What about the solution? For Gore, he basically was in Kyoto as the US vice president in 1997 and sort of said, look, we'll bring the US in, but what you have to do is give us this concession. To get Kyoto, for those who haven't been made familiar with this, is only a 5% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2012 beyond 1990 levels. You can see if you project the impact of what Kyoto is in relation to the business as usual scenario, no real substantive change. So dramatic reductions, of course, are necessary, 80% in the next 40 years or so, for example. So here we've got Gore trying to get a sort of scam in to say we'll have the US support Kyoto if carbon trading is a component. So